The heat warped the air above the platform, turning the world into an unsteady painting of brown and blue. Flies circled a rope-worn post. Men shaded their eyes with stained palms and spat tobacco into the dust. July 14, 1883, Dusty Creek smelled of sweat, horse sweat, and sun-baked wood, and the day itself seemed determined to press whatever dignity remained out of everyone on that wooden stage. Annie Wedfield stood on that stage as if it were the last place she would allow herself to be small. Her dress was plain, the color surrendered to too many washings, but the collar was stitched neat and the seams straight. Small acts of care she maintained as if by habit alone. There had been a time, not too many years before, when she kept books in a Boston office, when she could read a ledger like a man might read a face. She kept that truth tucked beneath the sharpness of the town's jeers. They called it a sale. They called it a resolution, some kind of public sorting of what, in Dusty Creek, counted for utility. What it was, when you stepped back far enough to name it plainly, was shameless. Women stood on the platform like weathered goods to be taken if a purse weighed heavy enough. The auctioneer's voice hawked phrases like a man hawking mules, and the words that wrapped around Annie's ears were scornful measures. Leftover, unsuitable, no dowry. Men laughed. Josephine Coldwell, with her hair coiled like a crown and an opinion for every crossing, clucked and nodded as if punctuating the verdict of the crowd. Annie could have spoken. She could have called out the men for what this was, could have stood the platform and demanded justice. But justice, in places like Dusty Creek, was a rumor made of other people. Instead, she kept her chin set and let the shame arrive like weather, unearned and unavoidable, while inside she arranged the fragments of herself into sensible piles. Her fingers flexed once, as if caring for a small book that no one could take from her. Marcus Bond moved through the air like a sour shadow. He was broad and liked the sound his boots made on planks. He leaned over the auction rail and jeered loud enough for half the town to hear, letting words that smelled like money and power land where they pleased. "$50," he said. "I'll take her for $50 and a roof. Bring her along." Laughter answered him. The world tilted. Eyes on Annie seemed to weigh her and find her wanting. That was when Eli Brennan walked up the main street of Dusty Creek and paused at the edge of the platform. He was the sort of man you noticed only when you needed him. A weathered face you took for rock until he spoke, and a careful measured thing came from him like a quiet storm. His hat was older than his face. His jaw was the kind that had learned to hold back many words. He had come into town on business and stopped because the town would not let him pass. He had stopped because he could not abide the sight of a woman treated like a ledger entry or a barter. He walked to the foot of the stage and put a hand on the rail. He did not swagger. He did not throw coins to the crowd or call Bon a coward to his face. "I'll take her," he said, and his voice carried differently than Bon's. There was no relish in it, no sportsman's tone. It was a proposition, plain-spoken, practical. Not for show, not to keep. "I can offer work, room with a lock, a place in the house, and wages for what she does. A door that closes from the inside." The crowd, quick as anything that expects its pleasures to be uninterrupted, muddled between shock and amusement. Some murmured at Eli's restraint. He might be claiming to buy, but he spoke like a man offering terms. He made no show of ownership. Annie heard the words and, in that thin, almost private space where the sun had not yet found her, looked him over as if this were another of Boston's ledgers. What was the line of figures? What liabilities? What promise? She asked with a voice that kept its edges, "Will I keep my freedom to leave?" Eli met her gaze. For a man who had learned the economy of saying little, he chose his answer with care. "You can leave the first day you wish," he said. "But if you stay, I'll treat you as I'd treat any hand on the ranch. You'll have a bed in your own room. You'll have work and wages. You'll have the lock on that room. No one rides off with what's inside it." There was a kind of hush then, the town waiting for the punchline, the proper humiliation to be resumed. Annie could have refused. She could have walked away from the platform and the crowd in their eyes. There were reasons to take pride in that refusal. A London or Boston accent might have been better received elsewhere, or money hidden in an old trunk, or an uncle in the East to send help. She had none of those, and she had grown tired of the theater of pleading. She was not counseled by fancy speeches. She measured the facts, room, wages, a lock, and chose the thing that let her keep some interior sovereignty. "All right," she said. The word was not a surrender. It was the name of an arrangement between two adults. She climbed down from the platform, and Dusty Creek hummed like a bee whose hive had been slightly disturbed. They left that day with horses and a wagon, Eli's wagon patched and steady, and Dusty Creek falling back like a remembered bruise. The road away from town rolled through creosote and low, stubborn grass, and the land around them breathed heat. Conversation between them at first was a negotiation of distance. Eli offered the practicalities in small, efficient phrases. The ranch was 3 miles out. The house had a cedar room not used in a year. The garden needed a woman who could coax lettuce from the dry earth. Annie answered with equal economy, naming what she could do: mend, cook, tell accounts, keep books. She told him she could read aloud a newspaper, perhaps, and that she had once taught a room of boys to write. He listened, and when the conversation thinned, parked words where they would not have to be retrieved. The ranch sat like an honest thing on the land, a low house of sun-darkened boards, a stable that smelled of hay and winter's lean, a corral with the rough, honest lines of hands that had built it. There were outbuildings and a barn door that rolled on rusted iron, and beyond it more prairie that ran into the kind of sky that made you feel oddly small and rooted at once. Annie said nothing as they crossed the yard. She examined the house, not with Richter's appraisal, but with the same quiet attention she'd given Ledger's. She opened the cedar room and found a bed with a thin quilt, a trunk of old clothes, and a washstand with a tin basin. It was the lock on the door, an unadorned brass latch, that steadied her. It was, as Eli had promised, a thing to be closed from the inside, and when the sun slipped beneath the eaves and the house crooned of settling wood, Annie drew the bolt and let the sound of it be a small ceremony of sovereignty. The first night was a study in small noises. The house breathed around her. In the dark she heard a distant coyote and the steady jostle of wind through a tobacco sack. She took the blanket to her chin and read a while by the light of a tin lamp Eli had set on the washstand. The book was not hers, but it was an old volume of collected poems someone had stacked on the dresser. She read only a page before sleep thinned the language, and yet the image of a woman standing steady on a platform and choosing her way back into the world pressed under her ribs like a resolve. Morning on a ranch is not gentle. It begins with chores, with the necessity of milk and feed and fences. Eli, taciturn in the way of men who carry loss like a thing in their pockets, moved with certainty. He showed Annie how to unlatch the barn, where the harnesses hung worn but cared for, how to test a horse's flank for fever, how to split the morning's firewood so the stove would warm the kitchen before dawn. He did these things without sermon or pity. There was a story there, one she glimpsed sometimes in the way he stood at the fence line, jaws set against a memory she could not name. She worked as she had worked in offices and classrooms, with deliberate efficiency, taking each task to hand and performing it until it was complete. She learned the cadence of the house, the tin cups clink, the kettle's whistle, the satisfying groan of a gate's bar settling into place. She tended the garden like one who had read the soil's future in letters nobody else could decipher. Where the bedrock ground had long made farmers curse and move on, she coaxed neat rows of onions, watched lettuce form pale heads, watered with the small care of someone who understood that growth, even in the deserting sun, could be cultivated. Eli watched more than he spoke. Once, when an evening fire burned low, and the two of them ate beans from a tin and cornbread that had been halved between them, he lifted his chin to the stars and said simply, "Miriam liked rosemary." The name lodged in the room the way a thrown stone lodges in a dry creek bed, heavy, obvious. He neither explained nor declared. He offered a thread. Annie accepted it without demand. She baked bread that week with rosemary tucked in the crust and set a plate by the window. The gesture was small. It mattered. The town did not forget. Rumors traveled faster than wagons. When Annie went into Dusty Creek to fetch supplies, the main street tightened around her like a canal. Josephine Coldwell's eyes were prearranged for scandal. Charlotte walked behind Josephine like a satellite bound to a bitter center. Josephine's voice came first, sharp as a tin whistle. "Well, well," she purred, letting the town watch for a reaction. "Never thought you'd pick a man off his provender to do right by a woman." Annie met her with a look that was not apology nor plea. "I did not come into this for the praise of Dusty Creek," she said, and the cadence of the words carried a note of Boston practicality that surprised the town. There were snickers. There were those who averted their eyes, but there were also people who watched her and measured the angle of her back as she carried a sack of flour to the wagon, and in the tilt of that back they saw a kind of competence that did not beg acceptance. Martha, called Marta in the shorthands of the kitchen, stoic and warm, lifted her chin and gave Annie a nod when she passed. Small allegiance, but true. Marcus Bond did not pretend ignorance. He watched from the hotel porch with the kind of smugness that comes to men who have never been denied what they ask for. When he saw Annie in the street, he straightened to send a greeting that was all presence and menace. Annie answered him with the measured calm of someone who had practiced speech as a tool rather than a weapon. She did not seize the moment to deliver an accusation or call him to account. She kept her dignity like a thing in her pockets. That walk back to the wagon after the market was thick with a kind of electricity Annie had not been taught to recognize. There was pride in her measured steps, and there was a trailing line of spite from people who still liked to think of Dusty Creek as theirs to rearrange. Eli's hand rested once on the rim of the wagon, an unspoken message, a fence around the small space in which she moved. It was not a cage, it was a boundary. The night settled into a pattern, meals, chores, a quiet sharing of the sort that needs no grand confessions. Eli showed her how to mend a harness with the economy of a man who had mended things more often than broken them. He taught her which way a colt would take if frightened, and how the ground would tell of a flood even before the sky softened. Annie read to him once from the ledger of a supplier, and in doing so, she revealed not only her literacy, but the sharpness of her patience. She could distill truth from a long list of numbers. In the quiet of the house, after the kettle had been put on and the horses slept, small kindnesses became the mortar between them. Eli left a cup of coffee where she would find it. Annie dried the pans and put the spoons in order. They shared silence that felt as intimate as speech. On a porch one night, while a low wind moved the prairie like a sea, Eli spoke of Miriam again, not to ask for comfort, but to place a fact on the table. "She kept lilies in the spring," he said. "Always lilies. I'd fetch water for them before I left." It came out like a confession and like a description. Annie said nothing for a long moment, and then quietly, "They'll grow here if you give them water." And the two of them bowed their heads in small agreement with the fact that care matters. Yet even as trust grew in patient layers, Dusty Creek's undercurrents pulsed. Marcus Bond's tolerance for what he could not shape narrowed into irritation. The town's sympathy, which had been mostly a thing of idle tongues, had not hardened into defense. Sheriff Ford sat in his office like a man with a good seat and not enough steam to stand in wind. He knew the balance of things and the small cost of upsetting the wrong side of town. Eli dealt with law in the arc of a man who believed in rules as sturdier than temper, who would ask the sheriff when the law could be asked, and would do otherwise only when the law had failed him. Samuel was one of the steady ones, a hand on the range whose laugh could make a tired morning feel lighter. He had broad shoulders and a thumb that would find a splinter without looking, and Marta kept house and told stories the way that heat makes frogs sing, inevitable and deep. They were good people, and their warmth to Annie grew not because of pity, but because people notice competence and they notice when someone pulls her weight. Samuel worked the fences, Marta kept the larder. They took to Annie the way a good dog takes to a steady hand, and then, as summer strolled on the land with lazy days, the first thread of trouble pulled taut. Bond's men began to ride past the ranch more often, more slowly, their silhouettes sketched against the horizon like moving threats. They didn't do anything at first, just the presence of them mattered. A tipped hat, a terse word in town, a tightened look. Eli watched them from the barn with a hand on a tool, jaw leaning the way it does when a man is deciding what to do with his hands. Annie felt it in the evenings when the light shifted and the air grew cooler, someone's stare on the road, the way a hoofbeat paused too close and then resumed at a pace that asked permission. She kept her work tight and her voice short. She read by the lamplight and mended shirts, and the hours at the sink allowed her to think. She thought of Boston sometimes, not as a place to return to, but as a proof that she had once been someone who mattered because of what she knew. Here, in the wide and complaining sky, she was learning to matter because she could coax life from dry dirt, and because she would not answer to the town's decrees upon her mouth. One evening, as a sun-burnt sky rolled into the cool of a promised night, Marta came in from the yard with a face like flint. "Samuel's up by the north fence," she said, as if words needed no dessert. She had spoken in a voice that carried the weight of women who find things out. "He's riding out there to check the barbed wire. Said he'd be back before supper. He ought to be here." Eli set a cup down and looked at the horizon where the road vanished. The air felt different then, a small tightening at the base of the throat that had nothing to do with thirst. He stepped outside and listened for a horse's footfall. There was nothing but the meadow's quiet and the far-off occasional call of a bird. Annie stood in the doorway, hands clasped at a dish towel, and watched him go. The sun lowered like a coin slipping from the sky, and dusk blew in with its own hush. They waited, measuring the seconds by the pull of the light. When the first stars came, there was still no Samuel. Marta's worry became a low, repeating sound like a clock. Then suddenly, sound did break the hush, but not in the way they had hoped. A wagon door banged in town, voices rose, sharp and startled, and Marta went pale. She turned and ran, boots thudding like a frightened animal. "No," she breathed. "No, no." Eli was at her side in an instant, the way a man is when danger is not a theory, but a thing landed at his feet. Annie followed, and the three of them moved like people who have learned to compress their fear into action. The path from the house to the gate opened, and then closed around them with heavy, urgent steps. They found him where the road dipped, a shadowed shape half in a sunless ravine, half in the open. Samuel lay there as if the wind itself had been the thing to strike him. His hat scorched, his coat rumpled, his shirt dark at the collar. He was breathing shallow, and the warm, fine dust of the road had come up into his hair like a bed of small things. Marta pressed a hand to his face and let out a sound that was raw and immediate. Eli knelt and checked for a pulse, his fingers practiced and careful. He found one, faint but stubborn. They gathered there in the dusk like gathered things, Marta cradling what she could, Eli leaning over Samuel with a steadiness sharpened by panic, Annie kneeling and letting her hands be what she knew. Cloth applied to a wound, a compress for fever, furtive stitches where cloth might hold. There was blood, enough to make a scene out of what had been a simple ride. They worked. They moved with the efficiency of people who understand that the worst thing to do is to stand and name the misery aloud. As night gathered, Dusty Creek's closer lights blinked on. The town, which had watched for scandal, now watched for consequence. The hush that fell was one of people with their own lives to weigh. Josephine's carriage rattled nearer, grass crunching under ironed wheels. Men came out to see, the curiosity that had so easily fed the auction now flipping sour in their mouths. Some faces were slack with worry. Others were set in a hardness that had not yet understood what the cost of silence might be. Annie sat on a low rock and rubbed at Samuel's arm where a rag had been tied. She let her hands be the sort of hands that measured wounds and sewed lives back together. Marta's cry had been a small, honest thing that broke whatever good manners remained. Eli's jaw worked as he watched the road, as if he would find the men who had done this by the tension of his muscles alone. It was then, in that thin air between light and night, that the reality settled with a cold clarity. What had started as an auction, something meant to humiliate and reduce, had not been swallowed by the dust of the day. It had prickled like a hornet's nest and left something aching and red beneath its wings. Samuel lay there, and the town watched. The balance had shifted. The law could be summoned or ignored, the sheriff might come and hold court, or the men who held muscle in their hands might shrug and pretend they knew nothing. The thought of Marcus Bond and his men out on the road amused no one now. Eli looked at Annie, his face a mask of choices he had not yet surrendered. There was a line a man must cross sometimes, when the ledger of small affronts adds up into a debt that demands payment in action. He swore quietly, under his breath, a sound that was not prayer, not curse, just a name for the thing he would not let go. Annie, who had spent weeks collecting herself like stones into a pile of steady things, felt the old presence of that auction like a bruise. It had become a new thing now, not merely humiliation but a danger to the people around her, to those who had chosen to shelter her, and to those whose hands at the plow had owned no part of the town's pettiness. In the half-light she set her jaw and felt her voice, unused to public proclamations, arrange itself for a different use. "Samuel will live," she said, not as prophecy but as a plan. "We bind him, we fetch the doctor, we get the sheriff, we do what's right." Marta's fingers tightened on Samuel's shirt as if the grip could mend bone. You think they'll come? The sheriff will listen? Eli's answer was slow and not given to optimism. Sheriff Ford listens sometimes. He fears things he can't control. We'll go. But we should not leave this only to the law. Men like Bond make law when the law suits them. We'll see what paper and witness we can pull together. We'll talk to any man who rode past with a clear conscience. Dusty Creek looked on, and the town shifted under the weight of its own choices. Josephine's scowl had fled to some fold of her face where it might rest uneasily. Some of the men shuffled their feet. Others, who had found a safe satisfaction in the auction spectacle, had the sudden insight that spectacle bites back when people are not content to remain only spectators. That night, the ranch slept little. Lights burned behind the small windows, and the radio of the place, if a ranch could have a radio in the 1880s, which it could not, but if there had been one it would have crackled like this, was a low static of worry. Annie sat by Samuel's campfire and mended rails of his jacket, the needle sliding like a steady oar. Eli kept watch, his eyes on the road that had become a dark seam leading to unknown things. When dawn finally rose, it did not come with the tidy sweetness of a resolved wrong. It came as it always did, as light that made everything visible. There were footprints in the dust, some leading away in a hurried scatter, others circling as if their owners had been uncertain what to do. A horse's mane hung loose, with the smell of sweat. There were fresh tracks too, deeper and darker, leading to the north fence. Eli stood and took in the line of marks with a look that had no illusions about what men like Marcus Bond might do. He did not say it aloud, but the choice made itself on his face. They would go to the sheriff, because to do otherwise would be to let the town become what killed men like Samuel. They would demand witnesses, they would press clarity in paper and the weight of town opinion. If the law failed them, then they would have to find the narrow place between rightful redress and cruel revenge, and no man wanted to live in that place without knowing what he would become. Annie looked at Samuel and thought of the auction platform again. She had stood there while men measured her as if she were freight. She had chosen a door with a lock. She had thought that choice would be a refuge, that it would quiet the town's appetite for spectacle. But the world is sometimes a second-order cruelty. The attempt to shelter a life brings harm to those who shelter it. She had not chosen for Samuel to be hurt. She had only chosen to live with the weight of continuing forward. "Come," Eli said, and his voice had the flat clarity of someone who had decided what to do. "We go to Ford, we find what witnesses we can." He never raised his voice. There was no drama in it, only the steady pull of a man walking the tightrope between law and what men do when law is a gate that can be shut or opened at will. Annie rose and fastened her bonnet. The sun fell across the yard in a broad sweep, revealing the outline of the place where life and violence had touched. She felt the town's eyes like a pressure against her skin, and with them a knowledge that nothing would be the same as it had been at dawn the day she had stepped down from the platform. Choices had consequences. Shelters demanded loyalty. The town, which loved to have stories to tell on porches, might find that this one would change how it told itself. As they moved toward Dusty Creek, the air seemed to hold its breath. The road ahead was a thin ribbon, and at its edge a man like Marcus Bond waited perhaps. Or perhaps he was elsewhere letting someone else send in his hands. In the shrinking distance between the porch of the sheriff's office and the barn, the calculus of a town tightened. A public reckoning could come in papers and witness statements, or it could arrive in the more primitive way men with muscle decide things in the name of territory and rumor. Annie held the reins with a certainty she did not entirely own yet. She felt the heft of her own resolve. She had chosen to stay, to work, to bind herself to people who would not be gullible enough to believe the easy narratives. She had taken a door and chosen to close it. Now she would turn from that interior privacy into a public world that would not let her hide. The sheriff's office door creaked as they entered. Sheriff Ford was a man who sat at a desk like a man sitting in a boat. He saw the water and sometimes did not know whether to row. When they told him the facts, Samuel found, wounded, tracks leading nowhere, his hands moved to the ledger on his desk. He wrote with a steady, polite hand, and then looked at them with the face of someone who must choose which way the wind would blow. "I'll put pen to paper," he said. "I'll take testimony. But you know how this town runs. Men don't like to name Marcus Bond. He's a powerful fellow." Eli did not smile. "Then you act what you are given, take the statements, put them on record. If the law will not hold him, then the town must." The words were careful. There was a thread in them like a raw thing wrapped in cloth. That afternoon, as Dusty Creek's sun leaned to the side and streets filled with the ordinary migration of people, Annie went home the way a person goes after a skirmish. The world outside the sheriff's door felt different. The town itself had the look of a living thing that needed feeding. Rumors would reawaken. Josephine paced like a rooster with a hurt toe. Charlotte watched like a woman building a verdict. At the ranch that evening, Eli and Annie worked with hands that knew the weight of tasks. Samuel slept in the spare room, his breathing thick with pain but holding. Marta slept with her chair propped against the wall, the watchfulness of those who love keeping a sentry made of small gestures. The stars came out and inked the prairie with a scatter of cold lights. The night had grown huge and ancient, and from it Dusty Creek's problems looked both minute and enormous. Annie stepped onto the porch and held the railing, the wood warm under her palm. She let the night pour over her, and for a moment the memory of the platform on which she had stood returned as if a ghost. She had come down from it into a life that required her to be both careful and brave, to weigh law against action, to see that those who sheltered her were now at risk simply because they had sheltered her. She thought, with a dry sort of astonishment, that life had a cruel way of complicating kindness. She had asked for a door that locked. She had wanted a place to sleep and a job at which her hands would not be idle. She had not asked for blood to be on her doorstep, nor for the town to be wrapped in the scent of fear. But the world had its way of assigning collateral damage. Eli came out and stood beside her, silent the way men are who have learned to hold a landscape of grief without speaking the names. He handed her a cup of coffee with both hands. The steam rose, and the scent of it made the night feel less empty. "You did right," he said at last, not a sermon but an observation. "You came when it mattered. You held him." Annie looked at the cup, at the dark liquid, and then at the man who had given her a room and had refused to make her a thing. "I chose to stay," she said, and the words fell between them like a ledger closed and signed. "Not to make of this something it was not. I chose this room because it lets me keep what's mine." She paused, and there was a hard, honest light in her eyes. "But I will not let Dusty Creek turn the kindness I asked for into a reason for harm." Eli's jaw loosened a little. "We'll see what the law can do," he said. "If it stumbles, we'll do the next thing." They did not know then what the next thing would look like, but under that star-splattered sky, with Samuel's breathing a living thing in the house and Marta working through the night like a quiet clock, an agreement was formed without speech, that dignity would be defended and that the line between shelter and possession would be kept intact. Somewhere down the road, a horse shifted, and the stability of the night accepted a new note. The town was waking to the fact that the auction's insult could not be left as a simple spectacle. People who had applauded and jeered found themselves looking at the place of their own entertainment and wondering if they had also been complicit when we watched another human being reduced to trade. A reckoning, small and unrefined, had begun to itch. As Annie finished her coffee, across the yard a dog barked once and then settled. The wind brought a scent of rosemary from where she had planted a small sprig by the kitchen window, just as Eli had once described the flower his late wife liked. It was a small human thing amid the larger unrest. In the quiet, her hands, calloused now at the joints, practiced in tasks both domestic and necessary, folded around the cup and felt like tools. They had been given a place to work. They would get to work, one way or another. At dawn the next day, Eli hitched a horse and set off toward the north fence to see what could be gathered from the tracks. Annie watched him go, the towing rope catching sunlight, his silhouette steady against the plain. She felt, for a strange, fierce second, a gratitude that had nothing to do with romance. It was gratitude for a man who would not pretend the world had not been unkind, and for someone who offered a kind of practical protection instead of possessive zeal. She had not expected rescue when she left the platform. She expected work. But the man who had worn his grief like a quiet mantle had stepped into the place between what violence had intended and what human decency demanded. He had not rescued her from the fact of humiliation. He had simply offered her a path that let her hold on to her own name. The road between that porch and the north fence was empty for a time, but after noon a rider came, spurred and breathless. Marta met him at the gate, her face a flurry of motion. She brought news. Samuel had ridden out to check the fence and had not been seen for hours. A search party was forming at the south end of town. Bond's men had been seen riding in the direction of the North Road just an hour before. Annie felt the soil tighten under her feet. The world had adjusted its geometry. There would be no smooth law that evening if men who believed themselves above consequence had decided to act with their hands. She could taste the shape of what might come, and she felt the old auction in a new place. The town's appetite for spectacle had returned in a different shade, and now it had found a reason to feed. She reached for words and could find none that were adequate. She reached instead for the suture of things. Boots tightened, a shawl folded, tasks prepared. She would not be idle. She would be useful. If the law bent and the sheriff shrank, then the town would also have to look at itself and think about what sort of place it wanted to be when men like Bond made a habit of defining others. As the search party rode off toward the North Road, Annie stayed on the porch and watched. Dusty Creek breathed in and out like a living thing, a body inhaling its own small, restless life. The riders pushed on, dust trailing like a pale ribbon. Annie watched them go until their silhouettes blurred into the wide shoulder of the land. She felt a hollow, cautious as a bird's nest after a storm. The town had been given a question. Now it would have to answer. Before they splintered into the scrub, Eli came back and stood beside her on the porch. He had the look of a man who had worked a night without sleeping. Eyes a little raw at the rims, a hand that kept finding the rail as if to steady himself. "We follow what we can," he said. "We talk to any man who'll speak his name." There was no bravado in the words, only the steady arithmetic of someone who believed in consequence. If this tale has drawn you in and you want to hear where the reckoning goes, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one ahead. But if not, listen on. There are things to be settled in Dusty Creek that will not be solved by applause. The search found tracks near the north fence, hoof prints stamped south like punctuation marks. They ran along the scrub and dipped into a shallow wash where the soil took footprints like a record. The trail skipped for a time and then returned, as if the rider had been forced to turn or had been overtaken. Eli followed the marks with the quiet focus of a man reading a field, noting broken twigs, a disturbed tufts of grass, and the tins of a campfire half smothered by wind. By late afternoon they came upon a place more human than the rest. A tumbled lean-to of branches, a stray saddle, a tin cup cracked in two. The tracks widened where men had lingered, and there a scrap of cloth lay caught on a sage bush. It was the sort of small thing that pulled a story together. Eli crouched and picked it up, fingers careful. The cloth smelled faintly of tobacco and horse sweat. He did not need to look for names. The way the camp had been left, cups upturned, a spent cigar stubbed out, told of men who had been confident an easy bruise would be enough. They did not have to search the scrub long after that. Two riders came out of the low wash as if they had been waiting for someone to come upon them. They were younger than Eli, their coats still smelling of the road. They rode with the hollow defensive casualness of men who have done something they meant to hide. When Eli rode toward them, he dismounted and left distance enough so that no sudden movement would be mistaken for aggression. "You with Bon?" Eli asked, plain as a post. The question hung between them more like an invoice than a threat. The two men exchanged looks. One spat into the dirt. "We ride for whomever pays, stranger," he said. "A man's got to eat." Eli's eyes did not move much. "Did Marcus Bond send you here?" The younger man stiffened. "Marcus had need of a course," he offered, which was as close to a lie as a man can carve. Annie watched from the rim of the wash. Her hands were steady on the sewing she held, old stitches, new hands. She felt no longing for violence. She felt a determination that had the clarity of a well-hitched rope. When the man's evasive words came, she stepped forward and said, "If you were paid to ride it, Samuel, speak plainly. If you were sent to teach him a lesson, tell us." There was a soft surprise sound as if the world had not expected her voice to carry so cleanly. One of the men, younger and rougher around the collar, sucked air between his teeth. The other, older and with a lip cracked by a grin that did not quite reach his eyes, looked at Eli and blinked slow. "They said to teach him a thing," the young one admitted, voice thin. "We were told to make a mark. Marcus," he swallowed. "Marcus said make an example." The confession, small and human, sat in the dry air like a stone. Eli's jaw set itself, his hands folded against his ribs as if the muscles were trying to hold a thing back. He did not raise his voice. He could have. The law was a faint thing here. Men with money and a loud mouth often bent it. He looked at the two riders, then at Annie, and made a decision that walked a thin line between calling the law and making the town see what had been done. "We ride to Ford," he said to the men. "You come with us. You speak what you did in front of him. Any man who will hide behind Bond's money is a poor sort of man. You can tell the truth, or you can keep hiding and let a town become owned by the loudest wallet." Reluctant agreement, coated with small fear, moved them. The younger one's fingers worried at the reins. The older man had the look of someone who had been in the habit of letting orders pass through him like wind. When they rose to leave, Eli signaled for two of the ranch hands, Samuel's friends, men whose teeth were as steady as their consciences. They rode with the party back toward Dusty Creek, the sun angling hard and giving the town's buildings an amber band. At the sheriff's office, windows threw light onto benches that had seen arguments before. Sheriff Ford lifted his eyes as the procession arrived, 3 men in tow, a rancher, and a woman whose boots still had dust clung to the leather. He measured each face and then the paper stuff of town, the eyes of a few onlookers who had drifted toward the steps, the murmur of the street. Josephine Caldwell's carriage parked like a judge's bench. Eli spoke first and short. He laid out what he had heard and where the tracks had run. The two riders, under the dim authority of daylight and the sheriff's pen, gave names they swore were true. The elder broke in a moment and confessed Marcus Bond had signed notes, had handed purses. The younger, shaking, told how they'd been promised, by Bond or by a man who was Bond's man, that making trouble would make them rich. Sheriff Ford wrote what he could. He was a man who respected order but feared upheaval. He listened to the admissions, then looked to Eli with the calculation of someone who knows what it costs to move against a wealthy man. "I'll take statements," he said, slow. "I'll hold these men and see what's in the ledger. You know how it is. Evidence needs shaping." Eli did not argue the limits. He had come with witnesses and tangible things. A cloth with Bond's thread in it. 2 men who told the story. Tracks that led from the North Road. He had come to place the fact of what Bond's influence had looked like on paper, and in front of a name that could not be easily denied. He left the sheriff to his pen, and walked Annie back toward the street. It could have rested there, paper and statements, some town whisper and a ledger. But Eli had learned, over years working a land that rarely lied, that a town's conscience often needed the pressure of a public light. If the sheriff's slow justice failed to keep the peace, the town would have to see with its own eyes what had been done in its name. He gathered the men he had taken, that older rider who had confessed to carrying Bond's orders, and several others who had seen the men ride past the ranch the night Samuel had been struck, and walked them toward the square. The afternoon sun made the board sidewalk hot underfoot. The aroma of fried food from a vendor's stall, and the weak smell of manure stitched themselves to the scene. People paused as if sensing something had moved in their town's stomach. When the party reached the square, a crowd had already gathered. Word had a way of finding ears in Dusty Creek. Josephine Caldwell stood with her arms folded, Charlotte beside her looking less sure. A ring of men formed, the kind who always liked to witness the shape of a confrontation, but never the work of consequence. Marcus Bond was there, of course, on the hotel porch, as if awaiting the spectacle he expected to control. He leaned on the railing, hat tipped back, a smile like a thin blade. He had been told he needn't soil his hands. Annie felt the circle of faces as if it were weather. She stepped forward with a steadiness she had not known she owned. Eli stood at her side but did not overshadow. He was a steady presence, not the type to shout down a room. He had brought men who would not lie to their own conscience for a purse, and they stood with the simple authenticity that made a town uneasy. The elder rider, one of the 2 who had confessed, spoke first. He named the men he had seen, the time they had rode, and swore under the sun that Marcus Bond had been the man funding a campaign to shame and to teach. It was not a fine legal recital, but it had the force of truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces flushing, others narrowing. Bond rose then, the way a man used to being obeyed rises when his authority is questioned. His voice, when it came, was modulated to charm. "There's talk and there's truth," he said. "I would not be the sort to pride myself on such things." He laughed, and the laugh had the brittle quality of someone who had never known welfare but had enjoyed its purchase. "You're making a mountain from a molehill. This woman—" He nodded toward Annie with that casual disdain, as if the transaction that had placed her here were still an open ledger. was temperamental, and men did what men do. Nothing Marcus did would harm the good folk. Let the law decide. It was a cheap attempt to flatten what had been said into the shape of a rumor. But then Annie stepped forward and she spoke. The crowd drew a breath like a group that had been holding it. "You sold me that day," she said, steady and clear. "You put a price on a woman and called it business. You said I had no dowry, no worth." Men cheered. You laughed while people bought and sold what you had declared they could own. After that, you sent men to hurt people who took me in. You gave money to men who made a man bleed on our road. You think the law will cover that with a neat little word? You think money wipes out a wrong?" Her voice did not climb into a rage. It was even, like a beam of light. It had a force not of volume but of authority. The crowd shifted. Some faces flushed with the memory of the auction, others with guilt. Bond's expression hardened. He took a step down from the porch, the sort of move a man makes when he wants to show the world he still stands on top. "You presume much," he said, voice low. "Mind your place, woman. Men with mouths not lined will not tell other men what to do." That was the moment Eli had anticipated. He moved as if restraining a horse, firm, careful. He had no thought of violence. He put a hand on Bond's arm in a way that the crowd could read, not a confiscation of the man, but a necessary control. "We don't need blows," Eli said, plain. "We need the truth. If you have the backbone, answer to the men who say you paid them. If you've not, stand down and let the sheriff do his work." Bond balked, and for a moment it looked like he might lash out with words that cut if he could not with hands. Instead, his mouth worked and he spat a refusal, half swear, half insult, before he pushed away from Eli's hold. A murmur of menace rose from his cluster of men. For a bright second, the square tasted like old dangers. Then something shifted. The men who had earlier cheered at the auction felt the air change. Their entertainment had been forced into the light, and their complacency had been made to weigh. Josephine Coldwell's lip trembled. Charlotte looked away. A few of the townsfolk who had come for the curiosity of it began to see not a show, but a wrong with consequences. Sheriff Ford, who had remained on the edge, stepped forward with the pen he always carried, a small symbol of the thin law that still could be applied. Faced with being seen, Bond's mask frayed. He had counted on small intimations of fear. He had not expected the quiet accumulation of witnesses Eli had brought. Under the sun, and with town eyes upon him, the ledger of Bond's misdeeds was not merely rumor. The two riders who had confessed, the tracks, the cloth, these were things a man could be held to. "I won't be threatened," Bond said, but his voice had a crack in it now. He saw that the town might not let its story be told by his wallet anymore. He took a breath and, in a deliberate act that was less surrender than calculation, he allowed himself to be guided by Sheriff Ford toward a chair near the office porch. The sheriff, who still feared the price of strong action, filed the statements. The paperwork began to make the wrongdoing less like rumor and more like fact. Eli never let the moment become something it was not. He had not come to humiliate a man for pleasure. He wanted the town to see that a life could be measured by the choices a person made.